Look at this chart. What you're seeing right now on the screen is the number of people of retirement age there will be by the year 2050 for every 100 people of working age in various OECD countries. I don't know if you realize what this means, but according to these data, in just 3 decades, in countries like Italy, Japan, and Spain, there will be practically 1 worker for every retired person. In other words, that the workers of the future, the young people of today, will not only have to work to earn their own salary, but they will also have to work to pay the pension of an additional retiree. Not to mention civil servants and the rest of public spending. In Europe, there's a bumpy road ahead. So what does this all mean, you may ask? Well, it means the following.
Public pensions faced worst funding declines since Great Recession.
Indeed, public pensions are in serious danger of becoming unsustainable. In other words, as the number of pensioners is set to skyrocket in the coming years, then pension spending is also going to skyrocket. To give you an example from these countries, in Spain alone, it is estimated that spending on public pensions could increase by up to 5 points of GDP, or even more, by the year 2050. An amount of money so significant that it would be enough to maintain 3 armies like the current Spanish one every year, or to double the number of schools, scholarships, and universities that currently exist. Now then, if so much money is needed, how on earth can it be obtained? What solution is there for the elderly so they don't get left without their pensions? Basically, there are 3 possible alternatives. The first consists of cutting money from other items, such as education or health. This is certainly not feasible, because there is no margin there either. In fact, healthcare spending will increase sharply as the population ages. The second is to massively raise taxes and severely damage the wealth of each country. This, by the way, does not seem particularly promising either, especially when we consider that this could punish economic activity and even end up reducing revenue. And the third, which is the one we are going to talk about in this video, consists of simply accepting that the system is not sustainable and changing it from the top to bottom. Although, that brings up new questions. Is there really an alternative to the current, very expensive public pension systems? Would it mean changing them to a perhaps more privatized model, or a cheaper one that could leave the elderly in ruins? How can retirees be guaranteed a dignified life without bringing fiscal ruin to a country? Well, how would you feel if I told you that there was a country that back in the 1980s already realized the enormous problems that pensions would face in the future? And before the demographic disaster took hold, it decided to change its public model completely to implement a half-private, half-public model, which today is not only very economical, but also manages to provide a good life for all of its retirees. Do you want to know which country we're talking about? Do you want to know what kind of model allows them to maintain decent pensions without going bankrupt along the way? Today on Visualeconomik, we tell you all about it. Tell me, how are the UK and Australia similar? Some will say in the language, others will say in the rock music of the 70s, with British bands like Queen and the Australian AC/DC, and others will say in politics, since both countries have a consolidated bipartisanship with a Labour Party and a half-conservative, half-pro-market party. However, and this is where the interesting part begins, the most significant similarity between these two countries is that in the 1980s, their economies were going completely downhill. You see, the 1980s were, for both Australia and the UK, a period of complete decline, a period of economic slowdown, and public deficits more typical of Southern Europe than of Anglo-Saxon economies. But take note that, although both countries had serious economic problems at the time, the odd thing was that they were governed by 2 completely different parties. In the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher's right wing governed, while in Australia, the Labour left wing, led by Bob Hawke, was in power. And do you know what? Right around that time in the 1980s, one of those 2 countries carried out the Great Pension Reform that we are going to talk about right now. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Margaret Thatcher, the evil neoliberal politician par excellence. Surely it was she who privatised British pensions, condemning British pensioners to misery, insecurity, and poverty. Well, no, far from it actually. It was actually the duo of Bob Hawke, a left-wing Australian Prime Minister, and his Treasury Minister, and later a Prime Minister himself, Paul Keating, who began to completely overhaul the pension system, and who semi-privatised it. It was Keating, by the way, who consolidated the changes. Wait, what? Leftist politicians privatise something as massive as pensions? How is that possible? Yes, I know, it might sound unbelievable, but it turns out that, as we've told you, in the 1980s, the Australian economy was in a mess. The traditional policies of the Labour government were not working to pull the country out of stagnation. And so, in order to not lose votes, the Labour Party decided to adopt the legendary strategy of adapt or die. Or, to put it another way, since its policies were not working, the Labour Party liberalised and began to propose fiscal and regulatory policies more favourable to the market and less favourable to intervention. And just in this sense, the pension system was one of the most affected. But why was the pension system semi-privatised? Was the system so bad for the public accounts that the Labour government had to reform it? Well, actually, no. It was not as bad or as expensive as the current systems in countries like Italy, Spain, or Japan. In fact, Australians during the 20th century had no guarantee that they would even receive a pension when they grew older. At a legal level, the government was not obliged to provide pensions, nor was there any public insurance such as social security to cover the costs. So, how were pensions paid then? They were paid out by the government budget. Each year, the leader of the day decided how much to pay pensioners and wrote it down in the government budget, which, as it turned out, led to pensions being quite meagre for survival, but let's not get sidetracked. The question is, if Australian pensions were not expensive and did not pose a certain funding problem for the government, why was the system changed? The answer lies in the fact that the unions and political parties, particularly on the left, realised something frightening. With the increase in life expectancy and the fall in the birth rate that would occur in the future, it would not be possible to continue paying pensions as they had been doing for 80 years. It was no longer sufficient to dedicate public budget items to pensions. A new system had to be devised that would be sustainable in its own right. A social security type system that would function as an insurance scheme and would bring in enough money on its own without depending on the government of the day. However, this system could not be the same as those in other countries where young people pay the pensions of the elderly. In other words, if the underlying problem was that there would be more and more retirees and fewer young people, the new system should allow retirees to be able to not depend on young people to collect their pensions. The question is, what self-sustaining system did the Australians come up with? How have they managed to have a stable, sustainable system that allows a good quality of life for most pensioners? Well, let's take a look.
A mixed bag system.
The Australian pension system is what we might call a tutti-frutti system. It's not a fully public system, but it's not a fully private system either. Rather, it has a bit of both, and more of the latter than the former. However, let's look at it in detail. The most important part of Australian pensions is the private, funded part called superannuation. This part basically serves as a piggy bank where Australian workers are required by law to contribute 10.5% of their salary to pension funds, with the idea that these will generate returns over time. But pay attention. Don't think that these private pension funds depend on four blood-sucking banks that, as in other countries, deceive people to invest in very unprofitable assets. No, quite the contrary. There are over 450,000 different funds in Australia today, investing in different sectors and earning different returns depending on the risk taken. In addition, for those who do not trust financial companies or banks, there is the option of self-management. That is, each employee can personally manage his or her 10.5% savings in the investments of his or her choice. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? A great theory. But beyond the theory, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Have these private funds really been profitable? Can the pensions of the elderly really depend on something as volatile as the stock market? Well, take a look at this chart. What you're looking at right now is the average annual return of Australian pension funds over the last 16 years. To give you an idea, on average, a retiree who invested $1,000 in 2005 could now withdraw more than $3,035. Not bad, don't you think? Well, pay attention because this is not the end of the story. In public pay-as-you-go systems, where the young pay the pensions of the old, if someone dies before retirement, they lose all the money from their contributions. But in the case of Australia, the opposite is true. Pension funds work as your own personal savings. That is, in the event of your death, that money will be yours, and yours alone. Or rather, it will go to your heirs. Be that as it may, and although at first glance the Australian system does not seem so bad, however private it may be, there is still a fundamental question to be asked. What happens to the people who have not been able to save enough? What happens to those who, even though they have saved, have chosen pension funds that are not very profitable, and are left without money when they reach retirement? Well, Visualeconomik viewers, this is exactly where the tutti-frutti system makes sense. For those who do not have sufficient savings in their retirement funds, the public system guarantees the age pension. This is a welfare-type system whose main objective is to provide assistance to those who have not been able to save during their lifetime. To determine who is eligible for age pension assistance, the Australian government conducts, at retirement, a thorough analysis of your wealth, and if they consider you to be wealthy enough, they either don't give you the pension or give you a very low one. Let's just say that receiving a public pension and owning 4 houses is out of the question. As mentioned before, the age pension is an assistance, so the amount of money is generally low. For example, in the best case scenario, a single person could receive almost 1,900 Australian dollars per month from the age pension. In any case, if we take into account both the private and the public part, we will see that Australia manages to guarantee pensions to its retirees equivalent to 65% of their last salary. In other words, if a pensioner before retirement receives $2,000 a month, after retirement, he or she would receive about $1,300 a month. And best of all is that since this system is relatively recent, it is very likely that this rate will increase over time. Why? Well, because younger people have already started saving in this system as soon as they started working, which was obviously not the case with their parents. Not to mention that we are only considering the mandatory amount that it is invested, since in reality, each worker can decide to invest more on his or her own, which has certain tax incentives. But let's not get sidetracked again. If the Australian system is characterised by anything, it is not so much for its very generous payouts, which is not a bad feature, considering all the compulsory contributions were small, but above all, by its sustainability. While the rest of the countries will have to cut their pensions and massively increase their taxes, the Australian system will remain a rock. But do you want specific data? Do you want to see how cheap this system is for the public coffers? Well, listen up.
Rock hard.
Let's get straight to the data. Australia's public pension spending is around 3% of its GDP. In countries with contributory systems such as France or Spain, that figure is well over 12% of GDP and is set to continue to grow to well over 15%. You see the huge difference, don't you? We're talking about traditional public systems that would fund the Australian system more than 5 times over. And that is not all. Beyond the low cost of this system, a fundamental key to it is that it serves to boost private savings and investment. As many of you know, Australia is one of the richest countries in the world. And according to the United Nations, it is one of the countries with the best human development index. They have high salaries, high productivity, relatively affordable housing. In short, an enviable economy. Well, what if we told you that their pension system has a lot to do with all this? You see, the total amount of money accumulated right now in private pension funds is more than $2 trillion, or 150% of Australia's GDP. All this money, instead of sitting idly in a safe, is used to finance business, industrial, and infrastructure projects, among many other ventures. And why is this important, you may ask? Well, because infrastructure is, for example, along with education, the public expenditure item that can provide the greatest economic growth in the long term. And yes, we're talking about projects that seek profitability, of course, not large public elephants. But this is just one example. Thanks to its pension system, Australia is developing a very powerful financial industry, and its companies and entrepreneurs have tons of financing. In addition, Australians also have investments all over the world, which end up returning capital to the country. And there's even more. To add to all this, thanks to its growth and enormous prosperity, Australia is, and has been, one of the world's leading recipients of investment and skilled immigration. This, in turn, has made Australia one of the countries in the world whose population will continue to grow until at least 2100, making the sustainability of its pensions even more assured. But is everything perfect in the Australian system? Is it just a matter of applying its model in other countries? Or are there problems that we are not taking into account? Well, as you can imagine, not everything is so perfect. Listen up.
System change.
You see, when a country moves from a public pension system, where the pensions paid today are financed by the contributions of young people, to a privately funded system, all kinds of problems can arise. For example, citizens may have serious financial ignorance that prevents them from choosing healthy investments with good returns, and instead choose junk investments with very low returns or too high risks. On the other hand, the Australian pension system, and in general, any system that includes a funded portion, heavily penalises being unemployed for a long period of time. For example, in the year 2021, the OECD OECD estimated that if a worker spends 5 years unemployed in the middle of his or her working life, that is around the age of 40, his or her pension could be reduced by more than 10%, which is a very significant cut. In other words, if you want to get a good pension, you should not stop working. Although to be fair, this also happens in the public contribution systems. And finally, don't forget that any mixed or private pension system is subject to financial risk. When a financial crisis hits, it will have a negative effect on the pension. Remember the large losses we saw in the table of Australian fund returns between 2007 and 2009? Although in general this effect is often greatly exaggerated. Be that as it may, the biggest and most significant problem of all this is that switching from a public system to a private system is a real hassle, and usually a very expensive hassle. That is, imagine you are 60 years old, and you've been contributing money to the state all your life in order to receive a pension. And suddenly, the government announces that it's going to change the pension system with immediate effect to a funded system. In other words, everything you would have contributed is worthless, and on top of that, you don't have enough time to start saving money in private plans. In that case, you would be out in the gutter, and unless the government comes up with a lot of money to finance both systems, the transition would be very, very complicated. That is why the transition process requires time and care, something that, obviously, in the case of Australia, was taken into account. You see, in order to execute the transition from one system to another, 2 phases were carried out. First, in 1987, the unions began to advertise private pension plans so that workers would begin to invest in the new system. But take note, because the workers did not use money out of their own pockets directly, but rather the companies did. And why did the companies agree to put up the pension money themselves? In short, because Australia was going through a period of inflation, and wages were being revalued every year. So companies and unions came to an agreement. Instead of revaluing wages in line with inflation, wages were frozen, and the extra money was used to pay into pension funds. So, well, technically, inflation served to change the system. After that, the government saw that the private funds were giving good returns, and in general, workers were happy with them. So, in 1992, Prime Minister Paul Keating implemented the second phase and decided to definitively change the pension model, making the private part mandatory for all workers. In any case, the transition will depend on each country, and the later the process is started, and the older the population, the more difficult it will be to move from one system to another. But well, before deciding whether to change the system or not, the decision depends on the citizens, on you. What do you think of the Australian pension system? What other advantages and disadvantages do you see that we have not mentioned in this video? Can you think of any other alternative model to the usual ones beyond the Australian one? You can leave your answers in the comments. Remember, you can highlight your contributions with the thank you button, and that by doing so, you can also financially support the independent media that is Visualeconomik. If you like the video, like it, activate the little bell so you don't miss any of the following videos, and see you in the next one. All the best. See you soon.